You're listening to Rights and Wrongs, a weekly podcast by Human Rights Watch. I'm Anthony Gale. A groundbreaking new report by Human Rights Watch has documented how Saudi border forces have killed hundreds, perhaps thousands of migrants at their border with Yemen. Most of these migrants are Ethiopian and are already fleeing drought, conflict, and a deteriorating humanitarian situation at home. They've been lured by smugglers with the promises of a better life and financial security. But when they get to Saudi Arabia's border, they're met with injury, even death. It's a truly horrific situation, and one the world should be talking about. I'm joined today by Nadia Hardman, who's a researcher at Human Rights Watch and the report's author, as well as Sam Dubberley, the managing director of Human Rights Watch's Digital Investigations Lab. Sam's team played a pivotal role in this investigation, harnessing open source data and satellite imagery in order to help verify Nadia's findings, that these crimes constitute systematic abuses. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Anthony.
First of all, the cases documented in this report are frankly horrendous. It goes into incredibly graphic detail of what we have recorded at the border. First of all, Nadia, from what you heard from the survivors, can you describe what's happening on the border?
Look, it's death. Generally, these are widespread and systematic killings of Ethiopian migrants and asylum seekers. I spoke to 42 Ethiopian migrants and asylum seekers. 38 were direct survivors, of these attacks, and 4 were friends or relatives of deceased migrants and asylum seekers who attempted to cross the border between March 2022 and June 2023. Their stories are horrifying. It's difficult to put it into words. I can tell you what they told me. One 14-year-old girl survived an explosive weapon attack. That is, she said she was fired on by what she thinks are mortar projectiles or what seemed like a bomb. And she woke up after having passed out and thought that people were sleeping around her, but she actually found herself amongst dead bodies. Another 17-year-old boy, another survivor of an explosive weapon attack, said that the Saudi border guards approached him and his group of survivors and forced him to rape the girl survivors. And he participated because he said that one man refused and he was summarily executed by the Saudi border guards. So really just, widespread and systematic attacks, which is why it's very particular. The reason why we're using that language is because it's part of the elements of the crime of a crime against humanity. We are saying that these abuses may amount to a crime against humanity. And the only reason why we're saying may amount to is because we don't have direct evidence that there is a deliberate, intentional direction to murder migrants and asylum seekers on the part of the Saudi authorities. But I think the evidence that we have points in that direction. Large groups of, what are mostly women and children, people tell me, trying to cross the border and, gunned down or fired at by mortar projectiles, rocket launchers mounted on top of Saudi vehicles. And they're stranded for the most part in Yemen without medical assistance. And really what I think is, just shocking is how many people say that they might try and cross the border again, because they just have no choice. They're either in the hands still of smugglers or traffickers, or they just simply don't have the money to buy their way back to Ethiopia. So they're just stuck in this just horrifying situation.
And just to touch on what you said there about wanting to return, as I've mentioned, the vast majority of the people attempting to cross are Ethiopians, and they're fleeing, any number of difficulties in Ethiopia. What is it about Saudi Arabia? Why are they fleeing to a country that's well known for its human rights abuses? Is there a link there?
Yeah. So I think it's estimated that about 750,000 Ethiopians live and work in Saudi Arabia. There are an enormous amount of job opportunities for, daily laborers in the construction industry, domestic workers generally, women and girls occupying those roles. There are a lot of pull factors. And, I think we all know that Saudi Arabia is a massive employer of migrant labor, and it really survives off the back of these migrant workers. And, what I think is so ironic is that Saudi Arabia and Ethiopia actually have a memorandum of understanding, sort of an agreement to provide domestic workers, with job opportunities from Ethiopia to Saudi Arabia. So it really is almost incomprehensible that they're being killed in this way on the border. But there are enormous pull factors. And I mean, there's also the fact that many people are promised a very different reality to the one they face. And, the smuggling and trafficking route in itself, I mean, you could write several reports just on that. They're preying on Ethiopian migrants and asylum seekers in Ethiopia who are, I hate to use this word desperate, but I mean, generally are, in extreme poverty, or fleeing the conflict in northern Ethiopia, or suffering, drought in their agricultural lands, and don't have many areas, many places to go. The routes available to them, the migration routes, are limited. And this is one which is pretty old, and is pretty well run by a network of smugglers and traffickers in Ethiopia. They target migrants and asylum seekers, take them to Djibouti. They, forced to cross in pretty horrible vessels. A lot of them drown at sea, and then met with smugglers and traffickers on the other side in Aden, and then taken to the border. And the rest is part of this report.
Sam, this is a good place to bring you in. The Saudi-Yemeni border is inaccessible to most journalists and NGOs, so you had to rely heavily on social media and satellite imagery to support this report. Can you tell us a little bit about how these methods work together in tandem?
So what we were able to do working with Nadia was collect as many videos as we could, both from TikTok accounts of migrants themselves, or people smugglers, or cat smugglers on the border, and verify those videos.
And to paint a picture, what was the content you're looking at?
Is the whole range, life in the camps along the route, and then actually the deaths and the injuries and the wounds of people.
Nadia, I'd like to bring you in here because Sam mentions camps, and having read the report and knowing a little bit from your research, I think we've really got to clarify what we're talking about here. They're not camps in the way that a lot of people think about camps. They'll think of, perhaps a refugee camp. You've got the support of your UNICEF or your Action Against Hunger. I mean, can you describe what's happening in these camps? Because it's pretty horrific in itself.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. Look, these are, camp, for want of a better word, they're basically informal settlements, if you like. I assume, and I obviously haven't verified this, but constructed by, the smugglers themselves, probably in consent and collaboration to some extent with the Houthi forces, who we understand securitize that whole area. And a lot of that is outlined also in the report, how, the Houthi forces that control the north of Yemen, play a role in, allowing everyone to be there, and, essentially also bribing migrants and asylum seekers and taking them sometimes from the camps to abusive detention centers inside northern Yemen. But yeah, no, they're essentially holding facilities. They are informal settlements, where generally people are taken to by smugglers and traffickers before then attempting border crossing. So there's nothing formalized about them. No humanitarian actors that we understand have access to these camps. They are, as I said, securitized by the Houthi forces, and we haven't called them detention centers, but a lot of the people I interviewed said that once you go in, you can't go out. You're essentially in the holding facility, in the camp, in the informal settlement, until you attempt a border crossing.
So, Sam, to go back to social media and how we've harnessed that in this report to support its findings, I think what fascinates me is the increase in, particularly in conflict contexts, of how misinformation and misrepresentation is being used. I mean, we've seen it in Ukraine. I mean, how alive are you to the threats of things like AI, to orchestrated misinformation campaigns, and how do you police that or factor that into when you're doing your research?
Yeah, it's a very fair question, Anthony. It's a very important question. I mean, as Human Rights Watch, we're very clear in our methodology. Digital investigations, open source investigations, whatever you want to call them, are used to bolster and buttress findings that researchers such as Nadia have made. So we're not going to just take a bunch of videos and say, hey, this shows possibly crimes against humanity, or this shows possibly a war crime, without having actually spoken to eyewitnesses to the events. So we're very careful, we're very cautious. And with that care and with that caution, I think what we show in this report is still massively damning. Because we've carefully done this verification, because we're able to really put our stamp on saying we know where this happened, we know roughly when it happened, and it backs up the 2 or 3 people have said exactly the same thing to us, or more have said exactly the same thing to us. And I think it's by being loyal and true to this methodology, to not seeing the shiny ball that could be digital verification and go chasing after that shiny ball, but sticking to our path, that actually the digital investigations and the open source investigations bring their real power and help a report like this really come to life.
Sam, social media content is becoming increasingly central to prosecuting war crimes and other serious abuses. But many social media companies delete graphic content soon after it's uploaded. What do you think social media platforms can do to safeguard this type of content?
I think absolutely there is. People are taking great risk, even if they're unaware that they're taking great risk. They're taking great risk to film crimes or possible crimes that they are seeing, and they're using these platforms which were developed to share the stories. That was the whole premise when these things came online. Democratization of storytelling, if you like. So, if people are using these platforms to share what's happening to them, especially in repressive regimes, thinking of places like Myanmar, for example, where people are taking great risks to share, abuses that have happened in the borders, but also during the coup in Yangon and the other cities, or thinking of the people taken to the streets in Iran, who are taking great risks to share. People in Iran, their phones are checked, and if they have videos and photographs that show abuses, that can lead to a great deal of trouble for those people. So I think if they're being shared on these platforms and then removed for a whole host of different reasons, then then there's a problem. And I think there is an obligation of the social media companies and these platforms to make sure that this evidence is preserved for researchers like us, while balancing, and we have to balance other factors such as risk to privacy, risk to what we actually find on these platforms that can be quite horrendous to look at, of course.
Nadia, the findings of this report have been covered incredibly widely, from the BBC to the South China Post. They did receive a response from the Saudi government, which described your findings as unfounded and not based on reliable sources. How would you respond to that?
It's pretty consistent. It's pretty on brand for the Saudi authorities, to be honest. First of all, not to reply to our letter and our findings. And we gave the Saudi authorities, the Ministry of Interior, the Human Rights Commission, and the Ministry of Defense, I think over 3 weeks of a lead time to respond and engage with our findings and answer our questions, but we received no response. And the statement that you read out, I've read others, have all come in the wake of the launch of the report, right? But again, I haven't received anything directly. Anyone involved in the report, such as Sam and others, haven't either. So at the moment, we're just going off of statements, issued to others, which isn't particularly helpful. What we'd like to do is obviously have an engagement with the authorities themselves. But we generally don't have that dialogue with the Saudi government. Probably no surprise. But my immediate response to that would be, can we discuss? If there's really, obviously it's again, not surprising, but very disappointing that, there's an immediate reaction that the allegations or our findings are baseless, because to my knowledge, there's been no investigation. So, to say something is baseless is obviously, would be the result you would hope of an investigation and some kind of independent analysis, but I don't think that happened.
Sorry, you mentioned investigation. So obviously we've heard from Saudi Arabia. Sam, very briefly, unfounded and not based on reliable sources. You spent God knows how many hours. I mean, how does that make you feel? Unfounded and not based on reliable sources?
I mean, a bit like Nadia says, it's on brand. It's we're confident in what we have verified. We're confident in everything we've put out there. We're confident in our geolocation, so we know where these videos were filmed. We're very confident in our satellite imagery analysis, which shows burial sites growing over the last year, security apparatus at the border. So we spent time doing this. If we are wrong, I'd love to see how we're wrong. I'd love to be told how we're wrong. If something didn't happen at the border and we're saying it did, I'd love to hear why.
And so the US have also responded. And I mean, judging from your responses to that last question, I'm not sure you're going to be filled with enthusiasm, but the US have called for an investigation by the Saudi authorities. I mean, how optimistic are you that will conclude with anything approaching the sort of standards and rigor that we would expect?
Really, what we're calling for is, clearly an independent investigation. We're calling on the UN in particular to establish a UN-backed mechanism. We're really keeping that quite broad. It doesn't have to be a HRC, a Human Rights Council mandated mechanism. It doesn't have to be headed up by a special rapporteur. We're really open to, whatever kind of international investigation that, can be set up. But, the point is to set one up. To ensure that there is some kind of accountability. And, we want to know if the killings do amount to a crime against humanity, right? Like we say that tentatively it may amount to, but clearly the facts that we've put forward and that Sam has also, corroborated so extensively with the visual investigation we've done, deserve the attention of the international community and an outcome. I mean, obviously, there are a bunch of other things that can happen in the meantime. Targeted sanctions of credible officials that are credibly implicated in the killings. A stop on arms transfers and sales, military equipment and training to Saudi forces, and of course, a reconsideration of participating in particular sporting events. Let's say. Especially when, those sporting events are put in place to deflect, attention from Saudi, its human rights record.
Reporters cover that Barbie's going to be played in cinemas in Saudi Arabia. I mean, the cynic in me and the PR person in me almost wants to congratulate them for what is an incredible PR campaign, because when the world should be focusing on what are increasingly grave abuses. We're talking about Barbie. We're talking about football. I mean, what impact do you think the sports washing, the laundering is having, both in general perception, but also when it comes to governments like Sunak, like Biden, who are both penciled to meet with MBS quite shortly? I mean, do you think it's having, is it doing what it's supposed to? Is it doing what it says on the tin?
Look, clearly, yes. I mean, Saudi Arabia has to hand billions to spend on these efforts, right? And I believe it is investing billions to deflect international attention, and it's doing it quite well. I mean, obviously, it's the political context, and then, the interest in a new player that wants to, occupy a different role on the global stage. I think this is, maybe a personal opinion, but I think some concerned governments and leaders, don't know how to ask for accountability when it comes to Saudi Arabia. What can we expect? But, I feel like we don't even try. I think is the point. It's just there's an expectation that, yes, Saudi Arabia has a terrible human rights record. But that mustn't be our expectation. We still need to demand a similar adherence to international norms, especially when we're talking about gunning down, women and kids at the border with Yemen. So I think it is working. I don't know what more we have to do. This report has gotten a lot of attention, and that's great. But, the hard part comes when we talk of accountability, when we talk about impunity and what comes next, right? Like what what does it mean to hold a sporting event in Saudi Arabia? What does it mean to sign a new player? Like what can we do to ensure that, more sporting events or international events aren't used to just take the light away from, essentially people dying, just trying to access a better life?
I think it is a very successful tactic. I think that's clear. It's a distraction, right? It's a distraction from what's going on. What's the saying? Football's the most important of the unimportant things. And we're talking about important things.
One final question. Despite a catalogue of human rights abuse in recent years, from Khashoggi's murder, the largest ever mass execution, which took place last year, not to mention people being arrested simply for using Twitter, global governments seem to want to foster ever closer ties with the kingdom. Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, is scheduled to visit the UK this autumn and meet with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. And there are rumours that Joe Biden is seeking talks with him at the forthcoming G20 meeting. Given that it's highly likely that these meetings will go ahead, what would you like to see world leaders pressing for when it comes to forging closer ties with Saudi Arabia?
Clearly, obviously, I've just written this report. I think the question that I'd want asked is, what are you going to do about these, pretty strident findings by Human Rights Watch, where your border guards are firing explosive weaponry and shooting women and kids, at close range on your border with Yemen. Why is this happening, and what are you going to do about it? I think it's not for us to say, rescind the red carpet, but I think you have to ask the question why, these leaders are rolling out the red carpet at this moment in time. It clearly, that should really only come when we've seen a change, a shift in Saudi Arabia's willingness to be a human rights respecting nation. That's what we as maybe Brits or the US holds itself up as, and other European member states, however hypocritical that might sound with their own migrants record. But still, the level of, just abuse we have documented on this border, I really would expect at the minimum questions raised if Rishi Sunak and Biden go ahead with these visits. And of course, we would want more. We hope for more. I wouldn't do this job if I didn't hope. But let's see, in the next few weeks, it's going to be interesting to see what actually tangibly comes out in terms of advocacy on this report.
I live in Germany, in Berlin, and, where we have a foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, who came into power lauding a feminist foreign policy. And what we're seeing at the border here is a vast majority of women and children being killed trying to cross into Saudi Arabia. So, I would hope Germany takes its role here very seriously to put pressure on Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and I think you sum it up very well, the pair of you, in that this isn't just about the sordid crimes that we've documented with Saudi Arabia. It's also about who we want to be as nations. And as Nadia, you point out very correctly, we haven't perhaps got the best record. Quite frankly, horrendous record at the moment when it comes to immigration. So thank you, Nadia and Sam. It's been fantastic.
Thanks so much, Anthony.
Thanks, Anthony.
You have been listening to Rights and Wrongs, a new podcast by Human Rights Watch. Our producers this week were Christina Varganova, Blair Palmer and Devon Schwartz. Our excellent engineer is Kosi Ogbuli. I'm Anthony Gale. Thank you for joining us.